I'm here with Congressman Tim Ryan, who is, like everybody, up for re-election because the elections are every 2 years. Do you think that this system of 2-year terms serves the voters the best? My sort of thought process on this for a while has been, you're campaigning a lot of the time, having to raise money a lot of the time just by virtue of it being a 2-year term. Think there might be a better way to arrange that, or do you think the voters are best served by this system?
Well, it's self-serving to say we should do 4-year terms. I do think in this environment that may be worth exploring, but the main problem is the money. I think we need to move to a public financed election system where each candidate gets a certain amount of money. I think we limit the amount of time so it's only a couple months like they do in Europe. And then you run hard, you knock on doors, you put a campaign together, the country talks about it. But if you don't get the money out, you're going to be spending 4 years raising money, and people just raise more money, and I think it'll eat up just the same amount of time.
I think there's sort of like 3 meta issues, and you name one of them right now, like whether you care about education or LGBT rights or whatever. You've got campaign finance, internet freedom, net neutrality, since that impacts coverage of whatever issue is important, and climate change, because if we destroy the planet, it's going to be hard to lobby for LGBT rights or whatever else. The people that are in power were elected by the system that we have, so fundamentally, it's not really in their interest to change that system, right? So like, how do we break that? Because you get somebody who says, I want to change the system, they get in with the system we have, that's the system that keeps them in. So how can we sort of shake that up?
Well, I think we need to organize around those principles, and so I think we talk about as a leading issue publicly financed elections. Like, that will pull the rug out from the issue that we're facing with climate, because all of a sudden the moneyed interests and that are behind that won't have the influence over the political system anymore. And I think also finding a way to talk about climate in a way that surrounds growth in the economy. You know, wind and solar jobs are growing at 25 or 30% a year.
Sure.
So how do we talk about that in a way that says, hey, a portion of that growth has to go to distressed communities, has to go to old coal country, old steel country, old rubber country, like a lot of the areas that I represent in the South, so that people will feel a part of that new economy. We also need, when you can't talk about climate without talking about agriculture.
Sure.
And that regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, a big component of sequestering carbon and getting us healthy food, which will drive down healthcare costs. So these are all interconnected, as you know, but the money is the real impediment because it empowers forces that aren't always in it for the common good.
It seems like negative externality is sort of the key element that's missing from a lot of the talking point discussions about issues, like for example with healthcare for all, whether you support it or not, or single payer universal, the idea that I've got to pay for somebody else's healthcare. Well, you know, crime goes down when people have care. People make better decisions about what job they're going to take that actually aligns with their values when they don't have to stay in a job only to keep care. How can we, it's simple, but it's also complex when you have corporate media with 4-minute interview segments, right? So like, what's a way to start talking about that concept of negative externalities in a way that doesn't have like a glaze over effect?
Yeah, I think you just started that process. I talk about the Medicare for All, which I've been a co-sponsor of since 2007, and then we just recently started the Medicare for All caucus. This is a pro-business move. You know, the one thing I hear from businesses all over the country is healthcare. What do I hear from my friends in labor that they have to negotiate about all the time? Healthcare. Get that off the books. Let's provide some certainty for the next 5 or 10 years. You're going to know exactly what you're paying in healthcare. So the business could, if they wanted to negotiate or give their employees more, basically a supplemental, a Medicare Advantage style thing that they could negotiate so they can have more, great, fine, do that. But we want you focusing on jobs, job creation, pensions, put money in people's pensions, and wages, and getting wages up. And if we can grow the economy by talking about Medicare for All, so I think we take it head on. We don't sit here and just say, well, it'd be nice for you to have it, and there'll be less crime, and you know, I may not live in a neighborhood full of crime.
Sure.
You know, I may not care about you, frankly. I mean, I care about you, but right. You know, somebody may not. Hypothetically, right, allegedly. But if you're telling a business person this is going to be good for your business, good for your employees, good for your family, then that's a much better argument, more potent argument, which I would like to see us start making. I saw Pete D'Alessandro, who was a Bernie's campaign person in Iowa, went and campaigned for him a little bit. He was talking about Medicare for All in the context of saving capitalism and growing the economy. And I think that's a really potent argument for us to make.
Taxes. So we have in the House, Democrats sort of, because of gerrymandering and the urban-rural divide, are at a mathematical disadvantage. In the Senate, just because you've noticed, in the Senate, you know, 1/3 of the seats are up each election, and it's not actually the best setup right now for Democrats. But hypothetically, taking control of one or both of those houses, would you support or introduce legislation to undo the changes to the tax code that Donald Trump's administration has put in place?
Yes, I would keep the middle class tax cuts and even find a way to maybe expand them. I'm on a bill with Ro Khanna to expand the earned income tax credit, which would put a lot of money back in the pockets of working class people. So I think that's what we would do. But we do need tax reform. You know, the corporate tax is a joke. I mean, it affects workers. And a fifth of them don't pay any tax at all. So we've got to find a whole new way to capture the income concentration that's happened in the United States, and that maybe there's a billionaire tax. You know, obviously raise the top tax rate, but I think we've got to provide some relief to the middle class because they're still not getting ahead. We saw just recently wages went up, I think, 2.9%. Inflation went up 3%.
Right.
So we're still not closing the gap on income inequality. It's actually growing. So we've got to provide tax relief, I think, in the short term for those folks. And I think getting rid of this joke of a tax, whatever it was not reform. It was basically supply side economics round 3.
Where would you put the top tax rate, and where would that bracket start?
I don't know. I mean, we'd have to. You can't. I don't think you can look at this as like one. It certainly has to go up.
Okay.
I mean, the main talking point was it should go back up to the Clinton era levels, which was almost 40.
Right.
So I think depending on what the other taxes you put in place, do you talk about a carbon tax? As we're dealing with climate change. Is that part of the package? Or what are you doing with barrels of oil? Is that something that you're going to do, which would all kind of fit together? So it's hard to say, but clearly the main economic issue we have today is the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. 80% of the people are struggling. They see the stock market go up. They see unemployment rates go down.
Sure.
They see GDP growth happen. That's for 20%. Those indicators don't mean anything to someone in Youngstown, Ohio at this point.
Right.
So you can't say what this level will be or that level will be without the whole context. But we've got to figure out how to get to this concentration of wealth and make the investments back into the country we need to make.
The sort of other side of this, or it's not even really the other side, but it's related, is debt and deficit.
Yeah.
And I've read a lot about sort of your positions over the years, and maybe some have changed on debt and deficit. I get a little concerned when I see Democrats talk about debt and deficit in the same terms that Republicans do, but merely with a sort of different perspective, because increasingly with modern monetary theory and sort of this understanding that deficit in and of itself isn't necessarily bad, depending on why we're increasing the deficit, if that's what we're doing, right? Do you think that the debt and deficit issue is a winning one for Democrats, or are they just playing into an argument that the right has framed in a way that it can't really be won on those terms?
I think it's an important issue because it's the responsible thing to do. I agree with you. Borrowing money like we do for our families. Unfortunately now, hopefully we can change this too and have tuition-free policies in the United States. But borrowing money to send your kid to school, for the most part, up until recently, pretty good investment. Taking a loan out to have a house, pretty good investment. Car, pretty good investment. Get back and forth to work. Those were investments that paid off.
Sure.
So borrowing money to rebuild the country, pretty good investment. So those are the kind of things we have to make. But at the end of the day, I'm for balancing the budget at some point. But when you have huge concentrations of wealth, and those people aren't, paying enough to help us balance the budget, that's the difference. You're right to identify that. The Republicans use it as a cynical ploy to say we got to balance the budget, so we're going to squeeze social programs. That's what they do.
Sure.
So they just borrowed $2.3 trillion for the new tax cut, and we turn around a week later and say, hey, we want to get money for SNAP, the supplemental nutrition.
Yeah.
What did they say? We don't have any money.
No, I get that, but even, when you say you want to balance the budget, why? What happens if you don't balance the budget?
Well,
because there's a lot of, hyperinflation. It's not totally clear that depending on why the deficit is going up, the deficit can go up $100 million, but if that $100 million goes into, for example, healthcare, which cuts down on employee absenteeism, which leads to higher wage growth, which the government then gets a piece of, it's not so cut and dry to me that just balancing the budget for its own sake is a winning talking point.
I don't mind borrowing some money, just like we do in our homes, if they're for good investments. But at the end of the day, big deficits like the ones we're going to have about $1 trillion deficit here in the next year, and it's going to run into the future. Adding $1 trillion and then paying interest on that is a problem. And then when you're paying interest on that and you borrowed the money from China, and China's taking the interest payments, and they're building islands and bases in Africa and investing in the additive manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, aerospace, wind, solar, high-speed rail, and dislodging us from being economically competitive. That's another reason why you don't want to be borrowing money.
That seems like the stronger issue to me than balance for the sake of balance, right? It's specifically why it is when the deficit goes up because people who are mostly saving the money as opposed to spending it or getting a tax cut. That seems to be a stronger argument. But again, it's like in 4 to 6 minute corporate news interviews, you're just not going to get that sort of level of nuance.
You're not going to get anything.
You're not going to get anything. What do you make of the split that, it definitely exists to some degree, but I'm curious to what degree you think it exists, between this movement on the left to go towards democratic socialism as opposed to social democracy, to the extent people understand the difference. I've been talking a lot about, there's some confusion about those two terms. Of course, democratic socialism being more actual socialism, social democracy more the Swedish model. Is this a split on the left right now?
I'm hearing more about it, but I don't know enough to actually say it's a split. I mean, clearly the free enterprise system is broken right now. We've lost the protections that need to be in place on the environment, on workers, on pensions, on wages, and on all these things that we've had in place. Unions, weakening unions, which were the main counterbalance to the free enterprise system. But I still think that the free enterprise system for us in America, if it's fixed and well regulated and operating the way it should, with an appropriate, strong, robust government to knock off the rough edges of the free enterprise system, I still think it's the best system for us in allocating resources, but also in innovation. We are a country of innovators and creators and entrepreneurs. The problem is all of that wealth has got stuck basically in 3 states. Venture capital money, 80% of it goes to 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. That's broken.
3 great states, by the way.
Phenomenal states. All blue. But, we need that investment in Youngstown, Ohio. So the system is broke. It's creating wealth. It's creating value. And we actually brought Silicon Valley, 13 venture capitalists from Silicon Valley on a bus tour in Youngstown, Akron, Detroit, Flint, and South Bend, Indiana. And what they said when they got to our areas, they said, there's things happening here that we didn't even know about. Innovations, creativity happening here that can lead to job creation. So the idea is this free enterprise can work, but the capital is now stuck in these 3 areas and in these wealthy pockets throughout the country and then concentrated to a larger degree. That's where you need strong public policy.
So that's social democracy. So if someone said, no, I actually think we need to socialize the means of production and eliminate private ownership of business and make that social, you would be against that, it sounds like.
Say that again?
So what you're advocating, fixing the free enterprise system, but keeping that's social democracy. If someone said, I want to socialize the means of production, that's not something you would be in favor of?
No, not at all.
Okay. 2018 midterms coming up. At this point, do you believe that in Ohio, not always a red state, but it's been a key state for Republicans when they've won at the national level, how much is Trump affecting races like yours or even more local races like state senates and legislatures? Is a Trump alignment helpful? Is it a hindrance at this point, or are the local races not really influenced by that?
It's super helpful in a Republican primary. We're seeing that all over. Even his tweets in Florida for the gubernatorial primary completely flipped the script there. All of a sudden, Trump's candidate took off. Not sure yet in a general. I think there's been a lot of softening, and we're going to see in the special election that's happening on Tuesday in just a northern suburb of Columbus. where our candidate, Danny O'Connor, is neck and neck now with a Republican in a district that Trump won by 11 points.
Yeah.
It's John Kasich's old congressional district. So it's kind of a Rockefeller Republican area, a lot of immigrants from Somalia and Bangladesh in that area. They're very tolerant, a strong LGBTQ community, slightly right of center on probably some economic issues, higher income people,
Yeah.
but tolerant. And I think they don't like the chaos, violates their Midwestern sensibilities, and the race baiting with LeBron James.
Sure.
and any other black person, he can stand up and say, oh, look, they're dumb. It violates kind of who we are. And so I think we're going to see a shift. I really do, that we're going to have a good year.
Congressman Tim Ryan, hopefully good for you anyway in November. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
Yeah.